Hello, I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP. And first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video will be on why I'm not a Christian, basically part 2. And the motivation for this video is certainly because I've tried to finish a philosophical treatise for a very long time titled Why I'm Not a Christian, in homage to the late Bertrand Russell's work. And I've yet to finish it. And so I write papers and philosophy, but I have not finished any of them. And that work would just be one of them. Basically what I want to say is certainly this is not none of this. Honestly, that title may be misleading because none of it is an affront to Judeo-Christianity in of itself, but it's an assault, or it's a pulling away from what I consider antiquated ideological positions or antiquated ideological frameworks. I think it's such that a great bit of the 20th century was a time of creating ideological or idealistic frameworks to be supplemental belief structures outside of the religious and traditional belief systems. And so you have various ideologies coming up, like Marxism, like the feminist movement, of the fascists and the Nazis, and the statists, you name it. There is a lot of them. And so the thing I notice with most people is that it's not as if once we let go of the religious conceptions, that we let go of ideological possession completely. And it's not as if either that we have made it such that we come up with any good answers for the problems that bear against mankind in its existence that are secularly based, insofar as a lot of the one thing to say is Nietzsche demands far too great of a pill for most to swallow. You have it such that Hegel leads to totalitarianism, roughly. I mean, you have it such that it's very rare that one person, because if you want to give the person the injunction to live in a howling wilderness without meaning, I mean, that's a rather difficult place. That's something that's next to impossible for a human being to take in bear. Then to say that there's essentially no meaning to the world, and that the material world is it's lifeless, yes, and it has no real deference towards human solace, want, or need, but to say that essentially because we live in an inanimated, lifeless world, that there is no salience or justifying element to human existence. So many things of the rational materialization of the world, or the creation of demigod ideological notions and paragons, all was just colored most of the 20th century. And we see the resurgence and greater instantiation of the Eastern traditions and Gnosticism, and basically just various reiterations of Gnosticism and Babylonian religious tradition. And so I tried to write Why I'm Not a Christian, which was just a ripping of the title. It almost has next to nothing to do with just Christianity in of itself, but I tried to write it as a suggestion for something different, a way to be and to exist that is different. And I tried to justify it with argument. And man, I tell you, it's really rather long and involved, and I'm not finished with it. I wouldn't show this to anyone, and I'm only mentioning it now. I'm not going to let anybody read it, so don't ask. I'm not going to let you read it. At least not now. And so I tried to do all of this. I tried to do all of these things because I have several beefs. And my first beef starts with Jean-Paul Sartre. And it's about his statement that existence precedes essence, and that was a direct affront to the Platonic and Socratic notions and the essential monism that underpinned so much of Christian ideology at the time. So I get why he was saying it, but at the same time, the two bedrock beliefs that underpinned, well, the reason why Sartre could say something like that, because what Sartre was saying is the fact that we experience what Heidegger calls as thrownness into the world is because human beings don't have any underlying purpose nor nature to them. And so Sartre did not exist during the time of neuroscience or cognitive science. So it's not as if Sartre could exactly know that more about human beings are there are more determined elements about human beings in their perceptual system and their brain than there are of things that are left to transformation and chance, per se. And so the only way he could say such a statement is this. Well, it's his analogy that he makes with a pocket Swiss Army knife. Essentially, a Swiss Army knife has a purpose because it has a design, but for human beings, there was no great overarching designer. And two, Sartre did not buy, most existentialists did not buy that empiricism or matters of empiricism could say anything about matters of ethics or morality. And they have reason for coming to such stances because materialism and logical positivism certainly didn't help its case in terms of ingratiating itself on people, because what logical positivists said was that the only meaningful things in the universe are the things that you can measure. Anything that you cannot empirically measure or create a correspondence insofar as you can test it and produce some result out in the world is meaningless. Art, and that's still something in a lot of people, logical positivism has not gone away. And that's something that I shouldn't say most, a small sect of individuals believe in. But it was the thrusting ideological underpinning or the scientism of the time in the 20th century, such that it caused a very, very strong reaction to what some analytic philosophers considered the continental philosophers, or just basically the humanist sect. They hated the idea that science basically said, or at least logical positivism basically said, that since you cannot measure human emotions, since you cannot measure human sentiment in any reliable way, at least at that point in time, in any reliable way, mind you, this was prior to cognitive science and neuroscience's advancements in technology, and the fact that you can't do anything like that for music or for art or for anything that somebody would put any sort of qualitative value-based stamp on, The fact that you can't do that with any of those things, they're essentially meaningless, and they have no place. And they went so far to say that they have no place in academic discourse. They have no place in human concerns or affairs. There was extremists that went to that extent, to that far of an extent. So it created such a very hard whiplash or backlash, actually, to correct myself, and various philosophical thinkers, and Sartre was one of them, because he was fairly much concerned with the phenomenological landscape. It's how somebody views the world in terms of what it is as a thing that has relevance to them in terms of their actions, their wants, and their desires. The phenomenological, subjective, revelatory landscape that we find ourselves deeply enmeshed in our day-to-day lives, that's the one that the existentialists and the phenomenologists care about. And the existentialists were heavily influenced by the phenomenologists, and the phenomenologists were influenced heavily by the early existentialist thinkers, Dostoevsky, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. And so it's this interesting dynamic. So Sartre essentially said, and well, that's Sartre's reason for saying that matters of empiricism have nothing to say or to voice here. So Sartre did not necessarily, and Nietzsche had his quips about evolutionary theory, and certainly the existentialists throughout all their history have had strong dislikes for certain truths of certain scientific truths or empirical truths for that, because empiricism is not a perfect thing, and it's constantly reevaluating its picture and steadily approximating itself somewhere rather than actually being in any one place at a given time. But I take beef with Sartre in the sense that there is no underlying nature to human beings, and that they don't have any purpose. And it's where I would like to turn to Franz Duval, a very brilliant primatologist and researcher, who gave sort of the first picture into the development of morality in primates. And it's to say this, that the fundamental underpinnings that humans share with all other primates is that we're things based off of seeming principles of fairness and reciprocity, and we're pro-social. In fact, we are so damn social that our brains, it's speculated that our brains evolved in the manner that they did because we're sophisticated social agents. And so far as we're able to do things such as the theory of mind or have empathic responses, we can get into the heads of one another and know essentially what one another are thinking to varying degrees, and that has range and variability across individuals. Certainly an individual like myself, I'm not so great at something like that. But the point is that it's fundamentally this. There's a line in Jefferson's Airplane song, Wooden Ships, that said, "If you smile at me, you know I will understand, because that's something that everybody everywhere does in the same language." And that's something that Duval would say is very much about the landscape of us being unabidingly and unabashedly social things that have a tendency to evaluate one another's actions and motivations based on principles of fairness and reciprocity. You might not mind being a jerk to somebody if they've been a jerk to you. If you've given something for a thing, you expect to get, or if you were promised to get something for a certain price, you expect to get that thing, nothing less. You might take something more, but you don't want anything less than what you were told you would receive for the most part. Now, there's definitely flex, variability, and change from people to people, but the reason I'm saying these things and bringing these things to the forefront is I would like to paint a picture like this. There may be I'm not going to say that there may be. There is. There is a fundamental underlying nature to human beings. And it is a social nature. Human beings are so very pro-social to the fact that the social variabilities and animating characteristics in them, outside of the motivational ones that they have as organisms, make it such that they can be heroes or villains. It's that sophisticated insofar as the hardware that we come with into the world, and in the sense that we are agents that act, and nobody has to tell a person what a growling dog means, or any kind of predator that approaches you and is in a attack or a panicked sort of aggressive state. Nobody has to, even in like a 2-year-old, nobody has to tell that child to be afraid or what's about to happen. Because, very really there are more things in your brain in terms of pathways and reflexes that make up the whole overall representation of the world and how you want to look at it in any given case and scenario. And it's to say that, yeah, there's fundamentally a human nature. There's fundamentally a human nature. And I've made a video before on why the blank slate, or the idea that there is no human nature, is a really bad one. It's a very bad one. And for the mere fact of this, if you tell me that there is no such thing as a human nature, I would ask you to tell me, why is it such that you can make drugs such as SSRIs? Why is it that you can instantiate patterns and behaviors in a human being in the first place? Part of the flaw of the idea that, part of the flaw of Pavlov's experimental dogs, because certainly this is where there's a lot of experiments that were done in Russia prior and during the Soviet Union, and there was a lot of experiments that were done in communist China, and not voluntarily, and same thing in Nazi concentration camps, but they weren't necessarily voluntary experiments, but that showed that you can torture a person or send them to the brink or instantiate patterns of behaviors in them that can rewrite everything that they've been taught or know and encode a new set of patterns and behaviors. And so what researchers and scientists took this to mean for a long time is that at bottom there ain't no real human nature, that the things are endlessly manipulable. It just takes it such that you have to get things to such a high varying degree of trauma, or really, it probably works in the other direction in terms of pleasure, but you just have to push them to a certain degree, and you can get them to be whatever you want. And that was that was part of the reason why the totalitarianism and communistic regimes decided to have sort of the ethics that it had, because it is figured, in the end we're going to get them to be the way that we want them to be, and if we have to lose a few bodies, or we have to take in, coerce, or manipulate, or do anything like that, it's worth it. Honestly, it's worth it. And then, when you look at it from the empirical standpoint, I don't think that you can, now, whatever, I'm not going to say that, never mind. But the primary point I wish to make is that there is a significant error in the reasoning that just because you can manipulate people, that they don't have any underlying nature, because of this. For the mere fact that you can do things to people that they deem as so awful that they're willing to change, or the fact that their brain has it such that they can experience a certain amount of trauma that it decides to give way to what it's already stored, tells you this, that there is actually some underlying metric of pain or pleasure, and that there is some underlying metric of evaluation that's going on there. What is it? Why is it? Because if human beings were completely endlessly manipulable and there wasn't any underlying nature to them, they couldn't learn. You really couldn't reprogram them. The fact that you can actually reprogram a human being, or the fact that they can store programs in the first place, tells you that they have a nature. because you can't have it such. I know the human brain does not work like a computer, but you could not have it such that the thing will learn and adapt if it doesn't have any sort of underlying motivations that animate it to reach something in the first place. So it's like this. If you want, it's the analogy that's best to serve is this. If you're a short kid and there's a cookie jar on the top of the fridge and you could potentially reach the cookie jar, the brain works insofar as it's trying to approximate itself towards things and trying to make it so it avoids certain things. That if it didn't have this approximating capacity to it, if it wasn't goal directing and motivational in the first place, it wouldn't learn. It just wouldn't learn, and you wouldn't honestly be able to program people. There would be nothing essentially at a certain point for it to be a thing that can take on and take off. Like, that just wouldn't be a thing. You have the only reason that human beings or animals or mammals in the that can respond to adaptation and change in the first place is because they're underlying and overarchingly motivational creatures. That they have drives, and that these drives move and instantiate them through these drives animate and instantiate them in the world. And it's this thing about us being fundamentally limited things and fundamentally motivational and value-based things that are, to me, the contrarian ideas towards the more popular existential vantage point and view. And I definitely consider myself an existentialist, but I consider myself a natural existentialist. And so far as this, that there is definitely an underlying human nature, and don't let somebody tell you that there isn't. It's more obvious that there is an underlying human nature than it's obvious that we're things that have no nature, insofar as that there's not a great deal of variability amongst people. I mean, I hate to break it to you if that's the first time you've heard that, but there just isn't. There's not 101 ways a brain can come to be. We honestly only know this now in these recent histories and centuries because we have the technology we do, but it stands to say that the ideological notions and things that we have need some revision and certainly need to change. And it's also this, that to say that there's no purpose to people, there's not an objective purpose insofar as that okay, so it's tricky like this. You are to be a social thing. You cannot help but be that social thing. That's what you fundamentally are. That's your nature, a social nature. It's there. You got no purpose but that one. And certainly, your desire and proclivity to reproduce is a part of it, but that's not all that's there. Insofar as people can practice monasticism, and people certainly can practice abstaining from those sorts of drives and desires. And it's for the mere fact that you being socially cajoled and appreciated means more to your primate mind than anything else. It's like the rare candy or the sugar or the sap to your existence. And you only have but one purpose. You do have a purpose. Your purpose is to be social. And if human beings have any purpose, it's to one another. Insofar as this, that we only exist, we evolve to exist in a world where there are things like us in the world, and insofar as we have to influence them, barter, trade, agree, disagree, fight, compete, and work with, in order for our existence to have any kind of shape and consistency to it. And that for that reason and for that why, people will go through a whole hell of a lot of troubles and do all kinds of funny, strange, seemingly strange things, because it doesn't seem to make any sense for why somebody would go out of their way to just create complete havoc and mayhem in the world? Well, it's because they're fundamentally social. And insofar as, like, why I say it's because they're fundamentally social is insofar as this. You only really have, I guess you only really have existence, or you only feel like you exist, or like you matter, or like you're there in the world based off of the impressions that you receive from other people. We're mirrors to one another. If we didn't have mirror neurons, and if we weren't such that we voiced, expressed, impressed, subjected, submitted, and dominated in various factions, there would not be anything to take this rather amorphous landscape that honestly has too much information and noise in it to make any sort of thing of definite value. A thing that could be held, grasped, and understood. And you don't have a self that can be made up without being around other people. It's just that we are this thing that's a social being, and our purpose, our nature is anthropomorphic insofar as that may seem redundant, but it's just to say it's a multifarious social nature insofar that it's a social nature with polarities and capacities to it that don't necessarily say it has to be pro-social, and don't necessarily say that it has to be anti-social either. And we're and our purpose is to one another insofar as we only exist because of one another. We only exist for one another in many regards. Even the most antisocial person, they just don't realize how they do it. And that's just from like a really empirical evolutionary standpoint. And so I guess that's just the thing I want to say. It started off as one video, but that's, I guess I'll end there because it's getting rather long. I'm trying to keep my videos under 30 minutes these days. But yeah, so maybe I'll make a part 2. So, what the title is? It's just a reason to believe certain things insofar as this. You don't have to, and I would say this, you don't have to believe anything. It's just the way it is. I mean, it's like, it's what you can honestly observe and understand from the world and just reasoning about things. It's to say that there's good reason, there's certainly good reason to move away from the ideological notions, because they're not necessary. They're really not necessary. And maybe I'll get to, maybe another video will be about why they're not necessary. But don't let certainly let somebody tell you different if you want. But either way, okay, that's my video. Thank you for watching, and enjoy the rest of your night, morning, evening, day, or whatever you're viewing this. Bye.